As a public university, we really do feel an obligation to work on some of the most critical issues facing our society today through research and our teaching of our students and, of course, public forums like we have today. So glad that you are able, as a general public, to be able to come and hopefully learn something and hear some provocative thoughts from our campus. We are pleased to once again partner with Mercy Housing. They've been an extraordinary partner over at least I think this is our 5th year doing this now. In particular, I'd like to acknowledge Doug Shoemaker, who's the president of Mercy Housing California. And then Amelita Pascal, is she in the room somewhere? Maybe she's still outside. Oh, there you are, okay. So she really did a big heavy lift on the program, as did Julie Lindner at the UCLA Ziman Center for Real Estate, who's out there too. So thank you so much. So as I mentioned, this is our 5th year, and in the past we've covered issues related to the senior tsunami and the future of housing and long-term care for elderly, for seniors. Then we covered housing as healthcare, the intersection between health outcomes and housing. We then covered LA's working class and middle income residents, so the missing middle. As we all know in this business, there's a missing middle that we need to address as well. And then we did a program on challenges to building affordable housing in Los Angeles. Today's topic is equally vexing and complex. It's this notion of democracy in the process of developing affordable housing. We certainly know there's a lot of friction in the system today in that regard. Perhaps good, perhaps bad. I think that's what the topic of today is, and so we're looking forward to a really good conversation. A couple of housekeeping items just for the format today. We will have a keynote speaker from former City Council member Michael Wu, who's now over at Pomona College, or Cal Poly Pomona. So looking forward to his remarks. And then we have 2 panels. One will sort of give you an overview of where we are today, and then the second panel will get a little bit more granular. Of course, we hope to reserve plenty of time for questions and answers so that we can get some good audience participation as well. This is a symposium on democracy, so I think that's required. And with that, I'd like to introduce my colleague at Mercy Housing, Doug Shoemaker, who I previously mentioned. He serves as president of Mercy Housing California, the largest regional affiliate of Mercy Housing. And during the last several years, they have expanded their pipeline dramatically and currently have over 3,000 homes in pre-development and construction. So Doug, in addition to moderating a panel, can certainly give some insights as to the development process here in California. At the same time, Doug has moved the organization to strengthen its work with public housing and formerly homeless residents, another big issue for Los Angeles, certainly, in the state of California, particularly with individuals and families that are struggling with mental health, substance abuse, or multi-generational poverty. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree in Comparative Area Studies from Duke and has done studies towards his PhD in Latin American history at Berkeley. So with that, I'd like to introduce my good friend and colleague, Doug Shoemaker. Doug.
All right, I've got a note to myself to get that bio off of the web somehow. All right, anyway. I'll be really brief. I just want to thank Tim and Julie and everybody at UCLA for putting this together. Howard Levine and his family graciously endowed this work, and it's been a really nice partnership for us. And I think one of the hard things about working in affordable housing real estate, or real estate in general, is you gotta take your moments to sort of look up and try and see if you can keep your eye on sort of what the bigger picture might be. It's kind of hard to do, and so once a year, this is sort of a nice forcing mechanism for us to try and think about how our work fits into the broader sphere. I guess the only other comment I'll make is just sort of, I started in affordable housing completely by accident. Sort of, you heard, I'm a PhD dropout. And I sort of stumbled into this group in the Mission District of San Francisco, and they needed somebody to deal with all the community opposition to the housing they were trying to build in that heavily Latino community. There was a predominantly white homeowner group that was called the Victorian Alliance. They owned a bunch of really nice old Victorian homes. And there was this heavily Latino nonprofit trying to produce family housing, and this incredible class is back like 95 or something like that. So that was my introduction to affordable housing. And you know, over the years, that topic has kind of waxed and waned in terms of my personal work. It's kind of waxed and waned in our sense of the field as well. For a while, it felt like we were all making great progress on this. Recently, it's felt a little hard. But at the same time, coming from that background in a community-based housing movement, like you have here in LA and in San Francisco, there was always the other side of that, the way in which the participatory process also enabled community activists to make sure that the housing being built in the Mission District and other parts of San Francisco kind of met the needs of the neighborhood and addressed those issues related to gentrification and displacement. So I think the reason for the I wouldn't say tongue-in-cheek title, but just the provocative title was, there are a lot of people walking out there who feel like they absolutely know the answer as to whether or not we have the right amount of democracy as it relates to affordable housing. And I think part of the goal for today is really just to kind of open that up, question those viewpoints, try and figure out whether we actually really all should be as confident as we are of our viewpoints on this topic, and to try and figure out if by the topic or by the process of talking it through today, maybe we kind of arrive at a little better understanding of where we ought to go with this topic, which is, I'm sure, going to come back again in next year's legislative session. So with that, I want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank all our great panelists for their time. And with that, I will introduce Michael Mencken.
When I was first invited to give this keynote speech, my initial impulse was to do it the old-fashioned way with words and no images. But about 2 nights ago, I got nervous, and I decided the audience is so accustomed to watching images on screens that it would be wiser for me to try to structure my remarks around PowerPoint, even though sometimes I'm nostalgic about the old days of giving talks without visual images. Save that for next time, please. But in the meantime, let me talk about this provocative subject. I didn't want to be in the position of claiming that democracy doesn't work. So I wanted to talk about not only a political system that doesn't seem up to the challenge, but also to talk about markets that don't work in terms of providing for the needs of the most vulnerable people in the community. And so that's why I'm calling this housing debacle both a political problem and an economic problem. And later on, I'll try to get into some prescriptions about what we might think about doing, but bear with me as I go through these images. I know many of you in the audience are probably more familiar with the statistics than I am, but let me give you a few numbers to define the scope of the problem we're facing. In Los Angeles County, it is estimated that 568,000 new rental units are needed here in LA County to serve the needs of low-income renters. Here in Los Angeles, it is estimated that there are 567,000 low-income renters who cannot access government assistance and who are literally at risk of becoming homeless. Overall, in California, the estimate of the unmet demand is 3.5 million new homes needed by 2025, so literally 7 years from now. That's to address the pent-up demand and the estimate of population growth between now and 2025. So these numbers are really daunting. So overall, we are falling further and further behind. Between 2005 and 2014, California built 308 housing units for every 1,000 new residents coming into the state. By comparison, if you look at states like New York or even Nevada, New York built 549 new housing units per 1,000 new residents. Nevada built 442 units per 1,000 in the same period. So this is resulting in the gap between supply and demand. The estimate is that in I believe this is the city of LA, that keeping up with housing demand in LA will require building approximately 5,300 affordable units annually. But only about 1,100 new units are being built every year. So you can see every year we're falling further and further behind. Furthermore, as a result of apartment owners taking apartments out of rent control, we have lost 20,000 rent-controlled units which were removed from the market since the year 2001, many of them demolished and replaced with market rate units at higher cost. So what this produces is a real predicament. We have too many people who are spending too much of their incomes on housing. In the city of LA, the average two-bedroom apartment, which the rent is $2,556 a month. In order to afford that, if you accept the rule of thumb that you shouldn't be spending more than about 30% of your income on housing, that means your household income needs to be $109,000. Now, it gets a little better as you get further away from the center of the region. For example, in Riverside, the average rent for a two-bedroom apartment is about $1,431 a month. So to be able to afford that at 30% of your income, your household income needs to be about $61,000. So that's a big difference. But there are many people who need to live closer to where their jobs are located near the center. In LA, 58% of renters in LA spend more than 30% of their income on housing. Nearly 1/3 of LA renters spend more than 50% of their income on housing. Now, the economic and the political implications of this is there are a lot of people out there who are spending money on housing. They're spending money they're not spending on things like food, education, health care, other things that are important. And to me, this points to a potential political coalition of owners and operators of businesses, leaders of industry who are being affected by the fact that such a large percentage of our population is spending money on housing, making it more difficult for them to spend money on other necessities. And maybe those are potential allies in the effort to produce more housing. So what we need, in my opinion, is a crash program, a crusade, a campaign, a mobilization to build more housing. But what will it take? My first thought was to look around, not just the US, but look around the world to see where have there been efforts to build large numbers of units of housing around the world. In Singapore, for example, after World War II, Singapore built about 21,000 new housing units during that 12-year period. Those new units were equivalent to about 8.8% of the overall population of Singapore. In Hong Kong, there also was a tremendous increase in the number of units. At a peak in 1964 and 65, the combination of the public sector and the private sector in Hong Kong built 61,000 housing units during that single fiscal year. That's at a time when the overall Hong Kong population was about 3.6 million. And then there's China. I assume some of you have seen the rapid urbanization that's gone on there. The movement of people from the countryside to the cities represents the largest migration in the history of the world. In 1949, China, 10% of China's population was urban. By 2014, that percentage increased to 50%. From 1978, when the urban population was 180 million, by 2017, China's urban population grew to 690 million people. Why did this happen? Well, there are a lot of different reasons, but the main point I would make here is there was a conscious, deliberate decision made in China that urbanization and the building of housing to accommodate the population was an overall national strategy, not just about where people should live, but it was an economic development strategy, and it was part of a poverty reduction strategy that is moving people from the countryside to the cities. I could talk for the next hour about the downside of how this was executed. Let's save that for another time. But creating so many housing units in such a short period of time caused a lot of chaos, a lot of pain, a lot of people lost their homes or were forced out of their homes. The traditional urban fabric of a lot of cities was destroyed, as well as environmental impacts, but they built a lot of housing units. So let's turn away from Asia and look at some other examples. My friend Bill Fain from Johnson Fain said, be sure to talk about new towns in the UK where there was less density involved. And I remember when I was an urban planning student studying the theories of Ebenezer Howard, the idea of garden cities. In other words, ways of accommodating population growth without replicating London, but by trying to create more livable human-scale communities. So after World War II in the UK, 32 new towns were developed, housing 2.8 million people. I don't know if any of you read David Brinkley's book about Washington during World War II, but one of the things that struck me when I read that book, I wasn't alive at the time, so I wasn't aware about the tremendous mobilization that went on in the early 1940s after Pearl Harbor, planning ahead for the massive increase in the number of federal employees and the number of workers involved in the war effort. In Washington, D.C., by 1942, there were 400,000 new units of temporary housing built and 18,000 units of permanent housing by 1942, which is pretty amazing. So before we get to California, let me stop for a second, try to summarize what are the main points. If there needs to be a mobilization, if there needs to be a crash program, what are lessons from other parts of the world? Anticipated in-migration or anticipated population growth can be an effective way of motivating government and the private sector to do something about it. In some of the places that I described, of course, there's not only eminent domain, but there was widespread power to confiscate property. It also doesn't hurt if you have a communist system, or if not a communist system, it helps if you have some kind of centralized or authoritarian system. It's a lot harder to run a not in my backyard campaign when a government in a centralized system says this is the way to go. And in the case of Washington, D.C., the crisis atmosphere represented by the beginning of the war led to efforts to find the resources and pull together the players and the factors needed to start to create so many housing units in such a short period of time. And again, I'm grateful to Bill Fain for pointing out it is possible to build a lot of units at human scale. That is not necessarily to either replicate London or to destroy the urban fabric. Now, I'm saving California because I think in some ways the production of housing here in California, especially in Southern California after World War II, yields certain lessons about doing things right. And by doing things right, what I'm pointing to is the success at normalizing the production of affordable units, perhaps not for the very lowest income, but at least for middle class and working class residents who wanted to enter the housing market. In the years from 1945 to 1975, 6 million homes were built, including 3.5 million single-family homes here in California. As I looked into this in preparation for this lecture, what really struck me was this unique combination of factors which doesn't exist today, combining the need to serve veterans, people who risk their lives for our country, coming back, who needed to find a place to live, and finding ways to pull together the resources to make this available. The GI Bill had an enormous impact boosting home ownership in the United States. There was a program called the Veterans Emergency Housing Program that in 3 years, from 1946 to 1949, produced 2.5 million homes nationally. Also, California was one of the places where the savings and loan industry grew up, making it possible for, making it easier for people who had never owned a home before to be able to get their first mortgage. There were also some other factors that applied in Southern California that didn't apply in other parts of the country. Land, the cost of land, the relative low cost of building. Also, the development of new methods of creating housing, tract housing, or other lessons learned from the industrial revolution that resulted from World War II, applying materials and technologies that hadn't existed before to the production of homes at a lower cost. This leads me back to the subject of this address. Is democracy really the problem? To me, the question is more, why is it that people who need affordable housing, that is those who are most affected by this crisis, why don't they have more power in the political system? I can't resist talking about an experience I had around 1986. I was a new member of the city council. I was interested in housing and architecture. The Museum of Contemporary Art came to me knowing that I was interested in these things. They wanted to put together an exhibit in their museum as a tribute to the case study houses that were designed by some leading architects back in the post-war period. But instead of and they wanted to commission a real housing project, but instead of single-family homes, which most of the case study houses were back in the 50s, they thought it was more appropriate to commission a multi-family project. In other words, an apartment building. So they came to me, they asked me if I'd support it. I said, sure, and I turned to the redevelopment agency. They found an empty lot at Franklin and La Brea in Hollywood, which was primarily used for selling Christmas trees in December. It was a piece of property that had been bought by the city of LA to widen the intersection, but largely because of neighborhood opposition to widening the intersection, it never happened, and people who lived in the neighborhood assumed that this was a kind of an unofficial park. It wasn't really an unofficial park. So we volunteered this land to be used for affordable housing. A design competition was held. The competition was won by the architect Adel Santos, which produced the drawing on the left. We got some subsidy money from the redevelopment agency, and this turned into a big controversy with neighbors who lived around Franklin and La Brea who were concerned about density, even though the 40 units in this project were actually lower density than many of the market rate housing units in the area. But density was one of the concerns. Frankly, another one of the concerns was having poor people moving into the neighborhood. I distinctly recall a neighborhood meeting that we had nearby that was, of all the experiences I had in 8 years on the city council, it was probably the closest thing to a lynch mob I have ever experienced. Fist fights in the audience. We had to call the police. My chief deputy had his briefcase stolen. Really horrible. And it was a hard fight, but this project ultimately was built. And contrary to the complaints that came from some of the opponents of the project, it did not become a center for drug dealing. Because of good management from Tom Safran and Associates, there wasn't laundry hanging from the railings outside. And you couldn't really, most people would not be able to tell if you drove by Franklin and La Brea that this is a project for very low income families. So it worked, but it was really torturous to get it to happen. And one of the lessons I learned was several years later when I ran for re-election, I won with 70%, but of course I pored over the map to see which ones did I lose, and this precinct was one of the ones that I lost, and I suspect it was because of this project. So if you want your elected officials to take chances, one of the lessons I learned here is it helps if the districts are large. Also, Also, it helps if the terms are at least 4 years. That is, maybe 3 years later, people will forgive you or forget about it. But that doesn't always work. Another problem with the way politics works is that in Southern California, political authority is very fragmented. And when you're talking about problems that don't respect political boundaries, like housing or economic development or transportation, our mechanism doesn't necessarily work very well to address those problems. I pulled out this fuzzy map of the SCAG region, but we can get into another long discussion about how did we end up with the system we got. I think in many ways, the system works well, but there are certain kinds of problems that cross over boundaries where the system does not work well. And then some of you may have noticed there's an election coming up. These photographs were taken from an article that many of you may have read about the positions of the gubernatorial candidates, about what they would do about housing. I thought that was actually a very useful article in terms of summarizing in a nutshell what each candidate was thinking about. But if you think about it overall, housing has not really been a major issue discussed in this campaign. It's hard to say, what issues have really been discussed in this campaign. But unfortunately, the issue of housing, which is so integral to the future of our state, really, in my opinion, is not being discussed adequately, either by the candidates or by the voters. So this gets towards the end of my remarks. I want to put a few prescriptions out there. The amount of land, the amount of available land is not growing, but there's more that we can do to use existing land more efficiently. I think one direction definitely needs to be to have more density around transit hubs. According to a study that was done by the McKinsey Global Institute, if we were to maximize the development potential around high-frequency transit stations in the Los Angeles area, there is the potential for as many as 903,000 more housing units. And that's not in the city of Los Angeles, but that's more like the county of Los Angeles. But still, that's a lot of housing units. Also, to make more efficient use of vacant land that already is zoned for apartments. In other words, infill development. According to, again, the McKinsey Global Institute, they estimate that there are between 5,600 to 8,900 vacant parcels around LA County that are zoned for multifamily housing, but they're vacant right now. And then, of course, there also are granny flats or accessory units, which taken individually don't have a lot of impact, but if there were more of these kinds of granny flats or accessory units around the city, the county, and the region, beyond the increments, this could make a significant impact. You heard in my introduction that I'm the dean of a design school, so of course I've got to say something about design. In fact, in the most recent issue of our college magazine, as dean, I have the authority to insist that I get a whole page to myself. So I wrote an open letter to the faculty in my college in the magazine, challenging them to do more to address housing, which from my vantage point is conspicuously missing in terms of what we're working with our students. Some examples of what we could do is for designers to come up with ideas about how to use more prefab or modular materials. For example, the photograph on the right is a photograph you may recognize of recycled shipping containers. It wouldn't be hard to go down to San Pedro or or Long Beach or other places and see these huge numbers of used shipping containers stacked up with no short-term use. Or there are other things perhaps that could be done to more efficiently use materials or modules that you don't think about for housing. Another example that designers could try to be creative with are so-called micro units. My niece, who's in her 20s, graduated. She finished her graduate degree about 2 years ago, and she just got a great job working as an analyst for a bank in Hong Kong. So she moved from Washington, D.C. to Hong Kong, and she's currently living in a micro unit in Hong Kong. Her mother, my sister, told me it's about 275 square feet. Some of you may have seen the movie American in Paris. You know the scene with Gene Kelly in his garret. You don't have to be a dancer. My niece is not a dancer, but she's adapted pretty well, after being accustomed to American standards of square feet and now suddenly living in about 275 square feet, but it requires adaptation. In her tiny unit, she has a washing machine that is literally combined with a dryer, and there are other adaptations that enable her to live in this setting. She also eats out a lot, which the restaurant owners nearby do not complain about. Some of you may have read about in San Francisco, there are some developers who are experimenting with designing dormitories for urban professionals. In other words, sort of like the dormitories that some of you used to live in, with a room with a bedroom and some social space, but no bathroom. In other words, saving money, but also saving space by having a shared bathroom. Now, for those who are older, that is probably not the preferable way to live. But again, to use space efficiently and to bring the costs down, maybe those are some of the kinds of innovations we need to think about. And then another idea relates to reusing buildings and structures that may be becoming obsolete. A few years ago, I served on the design competition for rethinking Pershing Square, which is something that happens about every 20 years. We rethink Pershing Square. And I was surprised to hear some of the architects on the competing teams talk about what they thought was the imminent obsolescence of the underground parking structure at Pershing Square. And they were coming up with some very creative ideas about what could be done to reuse those 5 or 6 levels of underground parking. Now, not necessarily apartments in the case of Pershing Square, but in some other cities, there are above-ground parking structures that are now being redesigned to be living units. Anticipating that the Uber and Lyft generation is not going to need to own as many cars, and so perhaps some of these parking structures are not going to be as needed or not as large as they are right now. So maybe there are ways to do things with parking structures or with obsolete shopping centers that are no longer economically feasible to convert them into housing. So as you see, there's a lot for the architects and planners and landscape architectures in my school to do. And if any of you are developers out there or city officials who want some smart young people to dream about things like this, come to me later and I'll supply you. Now, for the politically adventurous, I have a number of ideas that would be described as third rail ideas. Now, these are some dangerous ideas that are guaranteed to lose elected officials' votes. But let me put it out on the table here because, after all, we're at UCLA, right? So it's okay to talk about these things. Some ideas about what could be done either at the state level or the local level to try to create more incentives for the kind of mobilization for housing that I think is needed. At the state level, there is a law which does not have teeth to it, called the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. In other words, there is a calculation that is made of how many housing units are needed at the local level in order to serve the anticipated future population. In many cases, local governments disregard the Regional Housing Need Assessment because there isn't really a downside to not getting enough housing units to meet the target. So one possibility would be at the state level to link tax allocations to local housing performance. If you really mean it, you need to add teeth to compliance with this law. Some of you may recall back in 2011, Governor Brown proposed eliminating redevelopment agencies as a way of generating revenue at the state level. I've heard from some people in the governor's office that when he proposed it, he didn't really think it was going to go through, and to his surprise, it did go through. I haven't heard the governor actually say this, but in any case, back in 2011, one of the major tools for financing affordable housing in the state went away when the redevelopment agencies were eliminated. So I'm not suggesting that we should necessarily bring back redevelopment agencies, but if the state is serious about using its power to generate revenues for affordable housing, the legislature and the governor could do things such as setting aside more money from the state general fund, authorizing general obligation bonds, or expanding the existing low-income housing tax credit program. The next one is another one that is guaranteed to lose votes for politicians. That is to reform CEQA. I'm not suggesting eliminating CEQA entirely, but finding ways to limit it so that CEQA, making it harder for CEQA to be used for nuisance lawsuits against affordable housing projects. Lastly, Proposition 13. Proposition 13 bailed out a lot of homeowners back in the late 70s who were threatened by the gradual increase in property taxes. But it has baked in a system that is inherently unfair to those who enter the housing market after 1978, but also it's created perverse incentives for local governments to not encourage housing development and instead to encourage commercial development, car dealerships, or other things that will generate sales tax revenue to replace the revenue lost as a result of Proposition 13. So another way to try to make a difference, recognizing this is a very tough assignment, is to go back in and try to change or rewrite Proposition 13 to enable local governments to generate revenue without becoming as reliant as we are right now on special fees, which can have the effect of increasing the cost of building housing. Some other options. One option is the initiative route. This sometimes backfires, it sometimes doesn't work, but it is a method that is available here in California. I'm pointing specifically to Measure R, the measure that generated tax revenues to support expansion of the transit system. A lot of people thought this was never going to happen, and yet a lot of people, including people who never ride transit, but who perhaps were thinking that if this passed, it would get more of their neighbors' cars off the road. In any case, it got the votes to pass, an amazing political victory. And maybe something like that could be done for housing. Another route, which is possible, my friend Jeff Cowan, this is what I was going to point to. Another way to bring ideas into the political process is essentially going around the political process by using something like a blue ribbon commission. The reason why there is this photograph on the left-hand side of redwood trees is that a few years ago, I got a phone call from my former Santa Cruz College roommate, John Laird, who was now the resources secretary in the Brown administration. I hadn't talked to him for about 40 years. And he said, would you like to serve on a blue ribbon commission about the future of the California state park system? Which I never think about, but I said, sure. And what this was a blue ribbon commission funded by some of the largest foundations in the state of California who were very worried about the future of the state park system. So they were pooling resources to fund a blue ribbon commission and consultants and an outreach strategy to come up with ideas for revitalizing the state park system. And it had the effect, while it was paid for by foundations and implemented through the nonprofit sector, it had a certain level of support from the Brown administration and even from legislators. So when we finished our report after about a year, It was submitted to the governor and the legislature, and they actually adopted some of the ideas. So Jeff, that's sort of like what happened with, Jeff was the chair of the Blue Ribbon Commission back in the Bradley administration to propose ethics reform and limitations on campaign spending. So maybe there could be something like this with support from the companies who represent industries that are being harmed by the fact that so many Californians are spending 30%, 40%, 50% of their income on housing instead of groceries or healthcare or cars or other things like that. So this is another route. And here's my last slide. The famous housing policy expert, H.L. Mencken, once said, "For every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong." If anybody comes to you with a menu of solutions for housing that is clear and simple, they're probably wrong. But that isn't a reason to not dive ahead and try to deal with this problem, which I think you can all see is a major threat to the future of our state. Thank you very much.